Good afternoon and welcome. I am Flic Gabbay. I'm the managing partner of Transcrip, and we are running a session on the modern era of clinical trials. The COVID-19 pandemic and Brexit and a lot of other issues that have surrounded the pandemic has really changed the way in which we do clinical trials. Many of those things were being thought about beforehand, but really the way that we've had to do things in this last few months has actually accelerated those things, like the issues of monitoring and source data verification, as well as study designs, platform trials, and all sorts of things. It's really accelerated them into the public eye and into regulators accepting them. So we thought it would be a good idea to review some of the things that have changed and look at what will stay beyond the pandemic and beyond this rather unusual year. And in order to cover this, we have a great panel of speakers. We have Chris Brearley, who's one of my colleagues from Transcrip, who's been running trials during this period. We have Alex Phipps, who is head of clinical pharmacology for oncology for Roche. We have Dane, who's a consultant statistician who actually spends a lot of time looking at the anti-infective trials and how platforms or single comparative groups might be used. We have Bryan Katz, who's the Chief Commercial Officer from a CRO, to put the CRO's perspective. And last but not least, we have Marta Arias-Salgado, who is Head of Operational Excellence for MSD in Spain, and where they have started to bring a lot of their clinical trials in-house rather than with CROs, and have implemented many of the new techniques that we have been seeing changes over this last year. So I think what we're going to do in the session is for each of the speakers to give a little bit of the background to themselves and their perspective on the process over the last year and how it's changed the way in which the environment that they work in has come into bringing in quite different approaches to clinical trials. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Chris Brearley, who's going to talk about how we've introduced new kinds of trials where actually the sponsor is very much integrated with the patient doing trials remotely. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Flic, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Brearley. I'm one of the senior partners in Transcrip, and I head up the translational medicine team. I've been working in industry for over 30 years now, focusing really throughout that time on early development trials, from first in human studies through to proof of concept across many therapeutic areas. And obviously over that time, our approach to running these trials has changed considerably. And I think the COVID situation has forced everyone to focus on how we might run our clinical trials more efficiently and hopefully for the better. Clearly, COVID has had a major impact on clinical trials setup and prosecution. It certainly affected the way we need to work, and in doing so has provided us with unexpected new challenges and certainly provides new opportunities in terms of running efficient clinical trials and actually maximizing the quality of data that we collect during the conduct of those trials, to me, that provides the hope that trials will be more likely to achieve the outcome that the sponsors are looking for. Transcrip have been working with Synergen over the course of this year on one of their COVID-19 trials, this one being based entirely in the community setting. It's a trial of nebulized interferon beta. The trial is being run in a totally remote setting where patients are studied at home and have no direct contact with the investigators and the usual personnel who would participate in a clinical trial in a clinical research or hospital outpatient setting. Now, clearly there's nothing new about that. What we've been forced to do is to use techniques that have been used for many, many years, such as facilitating recruitment by using local press adverts, social media, and the internet. It's not new, so we thought we understood how to do this. But there were challenges we faced, which fortunately we're able to resolve, but were somewhat frustrating frustrated our efforts to get things moving quickly. One of the challenges, as an example, was trying to get through Facebook's bureaucracy. That was very challenging and involved many, many attempts to find wording that Facebook thought was acceptable, yet we knew was acceptable to our community as it had been through the usual ethics committee approval processes. We work with Synergen, and part of the Transcrip role is to screen potential patients and take them through the informed consent process, which we've been doing using Microsoft Teams or Skype or Zoom video calls. I was particularly surprised by the amount of remote IT support that we've had to provide for the older, less tech-savvy patients. And I can personally say it's taken up to 2 hours to get people able to use a video conference setup so that we can follow the GCP requirements in an informed consent process. So the team have had to have great patience, and that's been pushed to the extreme, as has their resilience. But also, it must be fair to say, it's been a difficult process for some of our older patients. And it's, of course, in COVID-19, we're looking for the older set of patients in the hope that we can prevent them being admitted to hospital. We have lost potential subjects because they didn't have the technology required to participate in the study, not necessarily being the absence of a computer or a tablet device, but many, many people still use old-fashioned mobile phones that do not support video calls. The informed consent process is online, and that presents a few challenges which are easily overcome. The important ones that we focus on were challenges including confirmation of patient identity. Well, once the patient is able to use their video system and can share their screen, then all we require is to look at a passport or a driving license, for instance. We also like to see confirmation of the positive COVID PCR test result from the NHS, and we ask that that get emailed to us. We can, of course, see those items via screen sharing. Witnessing informed consent is a totally new process to me. I've always done it in the clinic or outpatient setting. And again, this is achieved by using screen sharing and electronic informed consent. Using screen sharing, we can send the electronic informed consent form to the subject. We can see them downloading it and they share their screen, and thus we can take them through the various items we're required to as part of the informed consent process. The patient then submits the completed form, and at the site end, we confirm that we've witnessed that, and a copy of the consent form is sent to the patient. We do have problems, and one of our greatest problems, which surprised me, but perhaps it shouldn't, was potential subjects playing or gaming the system. One subject was actually in hospital, and it turned out that he was unsatisfied with his care, so he decided to try and join the trial. He used his iPhone and Zoom and set up a Zoom office background so that it would appear that he was at home. He was able to show his identity and positive COVID results, and gave a very coherent story and medical history. However, he was always difficult to contact by phone and made excuses as to why he should call us back each time during the screening and informed consent process. I was fooled by this. He was recruited into the study, and the following day, when the study nursing team tried to contact him, they were unable to do so. We had a backup contact number, which they called, and that patient, they were told that the patient had been in hospital for 3 days with COVID-19. So of course we had to withdraw him from the trial. But we do get a number of patients filling in registration details that are patently false, and we can clear them up.
I think Chris, that's a great start to where we. I love the idea of not being able to tell where patients are. I think that's I think that's going to be an interesting issue as we go into trials like that beyond COVID, and also for some of the remote monitoring that we're doing. It does open all sorts of opportunities that we wouldn't pick up with conventional monitoring. I think perhaps on that note, we should probably move on to Alex and talk about a little bit about program design in the future. A lot of the COVID trials, of course, have gone straight into phase 2 or have been rushed through programs much faster than normal. But then I think you've been looking at some of those, Alex, in oncology anyway already. So I wonder if you'd like to talk a little bit about what the future of program design might be that will be different from what we currently do.
Thank you, Flic. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, there's certainly been a change in the way we approach program design, particularly in oncology, where I've worked for the last 9 years. Prior to that, I've worked across a number of other disease areas as well. But COVID has helped to accelerate some of the things that we do. And I think one of the things that's really in the mix there is making sure we're as patient-centric as we can in our designs. And that may be in terms of the right patients being recruited, and also down to how invasive are our protocols and our requirements compared to what a patient would. Well, ideally, the patient wants a treatment. Okay, that's the you go into a trial because you want to get better, and how can we ensure that the focus or the impetus that we are giving is seen to be in that direction. So, for example, the last few years has led to some approvals of tumor agnostic indications, where in particular I'm thinking of things like NTRK gene fusions or mismatch repair enzyme deficiencies with Keytruda have led to indications based upon fairly small sample size, but across multiple disease conditions. And with the case with Keytruda was started in Lynch syndrome patients with colorectal cancer, and then moved across a number of different tumor indications. The same has been the case with the NTRK inhibitors, Roslytrek and Vitrakvi, where now these are moving into pediatric setting, particularly in gliomas, which is a terribly desperate series of conditions with very few treatment options as well. So that's a different, those are different protocol designs, and that leads into actually when you go into an entry into patient population, rather than just taking a trial of all comers and doing the safety and seeing whether you see a signal or not. Now we're basing our programs on expression levels of the proteins which we're targeting. If I was to talk about things like T cell agonists, for example, which need to bind to a specific antigen, rather than going in with all comer patient populations, and we'll look for the expression of that antigen prior to going into the study. So it's a more targeted population. So those patients who are going in are not going in for altruistic purposes, knowing that they're not going to derive any benefit potentially, but they will be hopefully helping to produce medicines in the future. We're trying to target that first patient with an effect now. And this is really, this also goes into things like remembering that every time we want a patient to take a visit for blood samples or for pharmacokinetics or pharmacodynamics, etc., how can we reduce biomarker analysis? How can we make sure that we reduce that as much as possible? So again, better use of model-based techniques to simplify the requirements for the patients in that respect as well. This is all about helping patients. Another thing that we've really accelerated in the context of COVID is the ethnicity question about who are we sampling from across the world? How representative are the trials that we're producing and those designs for the world population rather than maybe an Occidental population as well? And this is something that I see COVID has really acted as an accelerator. And when you look at the way that the data from the vaccine trials has been presented with that emphasis on the trials have gone across multiple continents, etc., taken multiple ethnicities, have been focused on the diversity of the world population. We are doing that more and more in trials now. And these, when all of this comes together, I think this is a natural progression to help design medicines in the 2020s rather than what we may have done in 1995 or something like that. The rigor within the trials must not be removed, though. You still have to have statistical rigor. You still have to test from an a priori perspective what you purported. Say you were looking for a biomarker change, you have to be able to show that you saw that or not, and then not just turn the interpretation based upon what you see down the line, recognizing how statistical values change with a negative result, but you find something else of interest. So none of the rigor goes, none of the good clinical practice goes. It's just that we are trying to open up different ways of running trials. And with that, I mean, I'll add some more perspectives in the Q&A session at the end, but back to Flic.
Okay. Thank you. That's very interesting. And I think that your comment about the rigor leads very nicely into Aaron, who's going to talk to us next about some of these diversity across geographies, different trial designs, platform designs versus our good old-fashioned old-fashioned, good old double-blind parallel group studies, which we've been so wedded to over the years. Do you want to give us a little bit of background on yourself and how we think alternative trial designs will fare in bringing us medicines faster and involving patients with beneficial outcomes in trials quicker?
Yeah, thanks, Flic. So I'm Dane, and I'm a statistical consultant. I've been working in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry for about 25 years as a statistician. And so as part of that, I've worked across various phases of drug development. And also I've been looking within the infectious diseases area at alternative design approaches, alternative ways of doing things to make studies and developing new treatments more feasible. And one of the things that I looked at there, as Flic mentioned, was platform trials. So this is where you run a trial which could study a number of different interventions, and often using a number of different sponsors' drugs as part of that as well. And so that's something that there's been a number of trials in the COVID, or a number of COVID trials doing the same sort of thing, because of the real need to understand how well available therapies work, and doing that very quickly. So this idea isn't necessarily new, and not new to COVID, because there's often been trials that do this sort of thing. And there are a number of trials in the oncology area that have been doing this sort of thing. But I guess that what could change as part of all this is actually either the idea of, could they be used more widely in phase 2 evaluations, because that's where they've commonly been used, where you study a large number of treatments and work out which ones have the strongest evidence to take into confirmatory studies. So that's one thing that could be done more broadly. But the other question is, could they be used more generally for registration? So that's less common at the moment. And clearly with COVID, it may not be registration, but it is sort of being used to understand which treatments should be used, rather than going on to study those treatments further necessarily. So I think they're the key questions that could be asked, is could those platform trials be used differently or more widely? I think generally the things to consider though, so that the benefits of a platform trial are, they could be much more efficient. So this study setup doesn't have to be repeated for every treatment. So you set up the trial infrastructure, and then all of the treatments are added to that trial. So that's could be a big saving. And the other component is that you can then use a common control group within that study as well. So rather than every trial and every sponsor having to recruit the same control group in effect, or a very similar one, you could use the same control group from that trial, which again reduces the patient numbers, which makes things more efficient. So they can be very big benefits of platform trial approaches. And some of the things that need to be thought about, particularly if these were used as registrational studies, are, what about the data collection? What sort of data collection do you have? So if you've got a situation where it's very standard data collection, or you're running what's described as a large simple trial where you're collecting minimal data because of the endpoint you're using, then this can be very readily done. You know, you could, if you're collecting, for example, survival status, then you could add a number of treatments. Whereas that becomes more challenging if you've got more detailed data collection required, and particularly if certain treatments need more detailed measurements because of their potential tolerability profile. So that can make it more difficult to actually just have a standard approach and just add treatments to that same protocol. So there are ways around that. And so one approach is to randomize someone to a various comparisons, so effectively studies within the study, because you still have the saving of the trial infrastructure, even if you don't have all the other exact savings. But I think what that illustrates is that just has to be thought about more carefully, and sort of considering what that means for running the study. And I think some of the other sort of feasible operational questions are, is the pipeline for that particular area sufficiently robust? So this is something that we've been looking at in the infectious disease antibiotic area. And it's of interest from the efficiency side, but the question is, are there enough companies, are there enough drugs coming through to be able to justify setting up a broader platform trial, and if you can't guarantee what's coming next? So whereas other areas where you have many treatments and many patients, you can see that this makes a lot more sense to keep that trial running. And And then also the other aspect is like a business consideration from the sponsor's perspective, is that are they happy to hand over complete control of their study? Particularly if it's the most important study in the portfolio, then that can be a big decision to make. And I think part of that then is providing trust in terms of who is running the study, and are you going to have sufficient input to that as the study goes along. And related to that is how the trial evolves then as well. So the key component there is what happens if one of the treatments is positive in that study? What happens to everything else in the trial? You know, how's that handled? And related to that is what happens when the standard of care evolves, either from what's happening in the trial or whether something external to the trial. So if you're in a platform trial and you're halfway through your comparison and the standard of care changes, where does that leave you within the study? Because you'd still want to continue your comparison, otherwise you end up with half the comparison on one standard of care and the other half on a different one, which could be uninterpretable. So these are all factors that would have to be considered, and they might well be different for an area where you can recruit very quickly, so that maybe that last aspect I mentioned is less of a risk, whereas if it takes longer to recruit and you're halfway through when the standard of care changes, that might be a different issue completely. So I think that summarises some of those issues for the platform trials, Flic. So I'll hand back to you and maybe we can pick some of that up in the discussion.
Yes, lots of interesting challenges, not least for the farmers that are running those kinds of trials or choosing to run these kinds of trials. And Marta is going to talk to us about what MSD has been doing in changing the way that you approach running these sorts of trials, gathering information, bringing in different kinds of vendors. And I think you've been one of the companies that has diverted from having preferred partner CROs endlessly, but more going to niche vendors and bringing in what you need and running the trials yourself. So I think we're very interested to hear a bit more about you and about the challenges you faced in doing that.
Okay, thank you, Flic. So hello, everybody. So I'm Marta. I'm the head of the quality organization in our clinical trial operation group in MSD. I have been 20 years in the industry, mainly in cleanups at country level, regional level, global level, and operational excellence, quality type of roles, and also directly executing studies. So a lot of process improvement type of work in the past years. And what COVID brought to us is basically a big playground to really test a lot of the things we had been discussing for years and maybe we didn't really dare to do, or it was too slow to make progress on them, and suddenly we were forced to go and try, no? So a lot of learnings this year. Now, linked to the partnership with the CROs, the CROs are critical, okay? They play a critical role in the clinical research environment today. So there's no way we could be doing anything in any model without them, and that's clear. There are many companies that depend on a full outsourcing CRO model. Merck decided to move out of that model already several years ago in a way to gain a little bit more control on our trials and where we were moving and making faster decisions. But that doesn't mean that we're not depending on CROs partners, okay? So basically, the main change was that we wanted to run the studies following our procedures and in our systems. But other than that, we are willing to cooperate with many types of different CROs. We try to approach them more in a functional service provider model. They complement our resources in subtype of roles when we need them. Of course, we collaborate with several of them, many of them niche CROs to support some of our endpoints. We have a very diverse portfolio, and so we have very different needs according to what type of data we need to collect. And you really depend on the CROs, and it's critical to have a great partnership with them at all levels. Especially during these COVID times, we needed to go fast. So I think we knew what we wanted to do or what was feasible in the current circumstances, But sometimes the CROs are more flexible than big sponsors are. So one of the things we could do through this partnership is for sure execute faster some of the decisions we needed to make because they were faster. They were faster in moving resources in different geographies. They were faster in acquiring services for us. So for example, if we had to implement telehealth services across some of the studies suddenly when we were not prepared for that, or home health care support, what we realized is some of our partners were acquiring other companies and then suddenly providing the service. So it was a great partnership, and suddenly it opened a different context for us to work with them. And we have been able to do that quite fast because they were ready to deliver the service, not just us purchasing a new system or something like that. I have to also to say that the partnership has been great. The CROs have also become more open, at least in the way within MSD at least, but I think that's more global, in the way we share data and transparency across the problems we have, both in the sponsor and in the CRO. So running quality to quality meetings, or having very open governance approach and meetings with the CROs where we are very clear on expectations, and also they are very clear when we are the problem in achieving something. These are critical, especially in COVID times. That needed to go very fast. Escalation was needed to go very fast. And so we worked a lot in the communication channels with our partners all the time. Sometimes we made joint decisions. Like I said, safety of the employees was a critical concern everywhere. Some of our CRAs are employees for MSD, but some are from our partners. And to be able to make decisions on what the CRAs could or not do in certain geographies, you need the employer. It's not about the sponsor, but it's the employer. So that partnership has been really critical. And so far, we've been quite happy. I think the current model we have has allowed us to have this approach that Mer decided. We didn't stop any study. When all this started, we saw some pharma started to announce some studies put on hold. Mer decided we're open for business, and our priority is to keep all the patients on treatment as much as we can. And well, we implemented everything to allow both open for business and patient continuity first. And again, we were able to do so thanks to the partnership we have with the CRO. So in any model, also, if we were to fully outsource a study, if we were a different type of sponsor as we are now, I think the CROs have a critical role to play, and they actually can bring a lot of flexibility to the system. So yeah, that's been our experience in the model.
Thanks, Marta. That's really helpful. And I think it does also illustrate how CROs can work much closer in partnership rather than this handing over the fence, which was the way that we did it in the past. And I think that's a good point to come into Bryan now to talk a little bit about your background and about KCR, which is a CRO and is possibly doing things in slightly different ways as well. Bryan.
Yes, thank you, Flic. So my name is Bryan Katz. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer of KCR, which is a mid-sized CRO. And, one of the things that, over, the last 7-8 years, where I've really gotten into the CRO industry, doing some consulting and at Abbott Laboratories before that. One of the things that I've really seen that's changed is it turned nice to haves into need to haves, right? Where, at many of the CRO that I've been at or I've helped in the past, and including KCR, we had these remote capabilities, albeit they weren't so critical in your overall workflow as they are today, right? As we've needed to pivot as an industry. And I remember I was actually in Berlin at the beginning of March at our leadership team meeting, and I had my whole year planned. It was, I had it all going. And then all of a sudden that March meeting really turned into 2 days of how do we take the nice to haves, a lot of these things that we had in-house that we had built, and how do we make them just part of the normal way of working, right? And some of those things related to, how do we just make SSVs, SIVs, IMVs just, more remote and embedded and integrated into everything that we do. Now, the other thing that really changed, I think, that, I think, again, a nice to have to a need to have was, we talk a little bit about, we understand the importance of site relationships from a competitive perspective, right? We all do, whether you are a sponsor or you're a CRO. We all know that investigators are in relationships with KOLs are absolutely critical to driving preference for your studies, to making sure that there's a proper buzz in the industry, right? Establishing, your asset and for not just the clinical research phase, but also for potential commercialization. So what we ended up needing to do, though, is we had to take a step back and not just see these as, these relationships as, initially, really driving experience that was different. We really need to be, expand our initial thinking to one that was more supportive, right? Because now a lot of these sites, they weren't able to even, they had to shut their doors. A lot of them, they may still have been seeing patients, but they wouldn't be seeing CRAs. I mean, it was a mixed bag, and that especially was reflected regionally, right? So the situation in the United States, of course, was, lagged the situation that was going on in Europe in the April-May timeframe. And so you had this transition of the overall tolerance of clinical research at a lot of these facilities. So the site relationship and investigator relationship really then evolved into a much more personal, how do we help you make sure you keep either your patients on therapy, that absolutely needed to be, because clinical research was, it was a oncology study that was actually a life-changing, therapy for their patients. And so then became this much more closer partnership and really helping them understand, okay, well, here's what we could do remotely. By the way, we do have these geolocation services available. So we have a call center, and a lot of other CROs, we're able to mobilize call centers, et cetera, to really help, reach out, work with sites to help them understand what are their alternatives given the situation that they have. Now, site relationships with investigators are one thing. On the other, it really changed the way we thought about our direct-to-patient engagement. At KCR, and I know this varies across CRO, we actually had built up a wholly owned subsidiary that was, properly dedicated to direct patient communication and outreach, right? Because there is this kind of fine line, you don't want to cross when you're a CRO and engaging patients directly. So we had this subsidiary. So now it really was about, okay, well, how do we best leverage this concierge service or call center that we've built to really, work and be this middle team that would help sites engage patients, understand and capture patient disposition, make sure that, record any safety events that might be happening, and really kind of fill this gap, for sites. And also really support patients, right? So if we understand and we're closer to the patient, and of course there's proper, informed consent in the middle there, right? From a procedural perspective. But once we got through all that, we're able to then really, be on the phone with them, reach out, et cetera, and make sure that they are taken care of to the extent they can. And potentially even with geolocation services, help them understand, okay, well, if this site is closed, where's another site that's still seeing patients? And so rapidly pivot and making sure that we're able to be this glue that exists between sites and patients to make sure that they are well served. Now, this entire scheme, while there's definitely an activation energy, to it that COVID brought, it is now going to be something sustained and I think expected as you start to move into the future, where now this business continuity, before I think business continuity to many people was mostly a technology issue. Now it's definitely something a lot bigger. and needs to be addressed with the proper tools and capabilities. Now, as Flic mentioned and others have mentioned, and Marta mentioned, a lot of CROs were able to plug these gaps by acquiring, tucking in companies here and there to really augment their capability set, which I think is now, when they're in that situation, I think you're going to be able to find that, the initial scramble that a lot of CROs and these partnering in this business continuity context, is not going to be there, in subsequent, potential pandemics, should there be, any, and unfortunately there may be, right? But at the same time, now they have all of these new companies and new tools, and they got to figure out how to best use them and how to best apply them, how to integrate them into their workflow, right? And these are all things that I think, and why I believe that, there is a high stickiness to a lot of the things that we've been seeing. Now, because they're going to be, because they are going to be, part of workflow going forward, integrated into the normal delivery model, it still begs the question, this is great, right? But you still have some anchors in the industry, things like 100% SDV. I know, having a discussion earlier this week with Marta, 100% SDV isn't necessarily, it's not something that everybody practices, but a significant part of our industry still believes, and they don't want to miss out on any data. And so this balance of bringing these new capabilities, this new kind of workflow that reduces overall risk in making sure that you stay in touch with sites and patients throughout a pandemic. What about all of that, right? Because now you're talking about potential risk to data. You're talking about endpoint, resolution, et cetera. And so there's still a bit of a give and take, I think, that needs to be addressed in the industry to really make a lot of these technologies, truly stick beyond, them being, just a capability that's only brought to light from a business continuity perspective. And so I'll hand it back over.
I think that's a very good point to finish on that, because I think that the themes that have been running through all of the things that we've been talking about is getting closer to patients, which I rather think that with our increasing infrastructure in order to make data better and better, we've actually got further and further away from the patients. And I think, Alex, your discussion earlier on around the trying to get something that reduces the number of patients and brings benefits in, I think I'd like to explore some of that a little bit more. But just summing up the themes that have come from this before we start our next bit of the discussion, we do need, I think, coming from everybody, to understand the patient's part in a clinical trial, which seems slightly odd, but it is a very critical piece of understanding their impact. And I did wonder with Chris, when Chris was talking, I was thinking, if we can't enter patients who aren't able to use the technology, are we going to bias the patients in our data collection and this sort of thing? So certainly the study designs and the robustness of data, which I think that Bryan, you were just alluding to now, if the data is not as reliable as we would like, then it really calls into question the evidence. So what I'd like to do now is just to open into a little bit of discussion, and I think I'd quite like to come back to you, Alex, about what you were saying about the patients and also the diversity and rigor, and how getting the patient perspective, reducing the number of patients that we use, increasing the diversity. What are the challenges that you face with all that sort of thing?
Wow, that's how long have we got?
It is huge though, isn't it? When you start,
it is huge. I mean, you can only approach
the more diversity is statistically where we really are challenged.
Yeah, so it's I mean, the question on diversity is not being afraid to open trials up in multiple countries. Sometimes we stick with what we know and what we're most comfortable with. Now you have to make sure you account for any potential risks of covariates associated with ethnicity as well. So there's a catch out in the first place. But that's really just embracing that. Now, it's funny because Bryan just mentioned about SDV, source data verification, and on-site source data verification. Well, you can't do on-source site data verification in the COVID situation when you can't even get into the hospital in the first place. So actually, you can use the remote SDV to branch out where you go to around the world, or where you consider, because you don't have to have somebody who's in and out of the hospital monitoring. And Roche has found that that's working actually pretty well. So it's dispelling some of those old myths about, no, you can only do SDV versus remotely. In terms of patient, so we don't necessarily reduce the number of patients per se. These agnostics can be driven by you're targeting the patient population, and ultimately FDA and other health authorities are for medicines which are showing clear, unequivocal benefit over a complete lack of standard care, often that your sample size can be lower for getting those accelerated approvals, which you have to substantiate with overall survival data anyway. If that doesn't come in, then you don't keep that part of your label. But I was thinking, we're thinking particularly, let me consider something like biopsies of a patient's tumors. These are one of the most evasive personal techniques that we do. And if any of you can tell me how the timing of a biopsy has been generated over the years, I'd be interested, because as far as I can see, it's putting a finger in the wind. So can you build on your understanding of the mechanism and what you're trying to see from the clinical pharmacology to optimize that biopsy? So firstly, it's given for the maximum reason, and you derive the maximum ability to understand from it. So that's the sort of thing about, we are asking patients to really, it's a gift that they are giving to us, and making sure that we're using that in the maximum manner. It's incredible when you see things like pharmacodynamic assessments being at separate times from pharmacokinetic assessments. Bring them together. Don't do this. Bring them together. Think about what you're doing on a pre-treatment versus the post-treatment perspective. Using reduced blood samples because assay techniques have improved over the years. So making sure, once again, that the patient is not a pincushion, to be sort of graphic about it, but making sure that we are reducing the burden on the patient and their care and their loved ones as well. Often they're transported into hospital, etc. Can you do more things in terms of a home visit? Patient compliance, moving out of the oncology area. There's all sorts of apps now where you can see whether a patient's taking the medicine or not. It's in their mouth, and they'll take a picture. Again, it's just removing some burden. It helps with compliance. It helps with trials getting to the correct answer, rather than you get an answer and you don't know whether it's because your drug didn't work or it's because your patients didn't comply. So we remove all of those sort of components. And the easier it is to comply, the wider you can cast the net in terms of trials. So ultimately, the ultimate benefit is for mankind. And COVID is the case in point that we want to treat the world. We don't. That's the incentive, and we can build on that.
Marta, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I wanted to complement some of these comments. No, we've mentioned the technology that makes possible the remote approach to a study, and then we were talking about patient centricity. We also need to be careful to follow the GCP principles. They are there for a reason, and it's not always easy. to use technology and really keep GCP principles valid. I have seen across this pandemic all type of proposal, for example, for remote consenting. And what we have asked our CRAs to do is be careful and make sure the patient's rights are still there, and that you as a CRA and the representative of the sponsor can monitor that the process is well run. And in many cases, that was not the case. And we have seen IRBs and ethical committees approving such processes. So I think it's great to have these remote options, but I think the GCP principles still are a guidance for all of us, and not everything is feasible just because it's out there. And so we have to try to find this balance that is feasible, is okay for the patient, it makes things better, it allows remote, but it also keeps the patient's right privacy too. I have seen as well a lot of proposals for direct shipments of drugs to patients, and some of them didn't take into consideration the privacy aspect of the patient data. So, it's trying to find the balance is actually very important, because at some point COVID will go away and regulatory agencies will return to have less flexibility. Some of the things will remain, but as long as they probably are okay with GCP principles. And I think we all have to remember that.
I think the other thing I would add, Flic, is that with using technology, it can obviously help in many ways, but it's making sure that all the appropriate patient groups are represented. Mm-hmm. So I think this was touched on earlier, so you may have certain groups that are maybe less au fait with the technology, for example. So if they're then excluded from the studies due to that, I guess there's two aspects. One is, are you going to get an approval from the regulatory authorities for that group? But even have you got information on that group who may be a critical group of patients that are not then as well served? So these are some of the challenges you'd have to think about around the generalizability of the results when we do some of these things, which clearly make a lot of sense in many ways.
Yes, I think that is critically important, because whilst we might learn more about the patients, we also introduce lots of issues around bias, and also looking at how the data is collected. Some of the platform trials, it's collected retrospectively after the patients are discharged from hospital, in a way that probably, actually, even when we're doing ordinary clinical trials, it's probably quite a lot of it's probably collected retrospectively. But I think these things all have an impact on the reliability of the data. And I think, Chris, I just wondered whether you had any comments on how actually seeing, I know that you have many times sat with volunteers and phase 1 patients in front of you, but is it different seeing patients directly in a trial setting of treatment, of phase 2-3 treatment?
Of course, it's different, but we mustn't forget that in terms of screening and recruitment of subjects, we're remote from the treatment setting. The difficulty is getting sufficient rapport with the subject over a Zoom call to take them through what can be very personal questions. That in itself is not too difficult to do. But if I may, I just wanted to follow up on one of Alex's comments, and that was in relation to clinical trial endpoints. What's been happening over time, of course, has been using fewer but more robust endpoints that you really need for decision-making purposes. And in remote settings, one is using very simple endpoints because you're collecting the data from the patient themselves. And you may have objective measurements such as pulse oximetry, percentage saturation, or indeed body temperature, which the patient can do. And you can observe, or the study team can observe them doing and make an assessment they're collecting the data properly. So that there are things that can be done to improve data collection, and it's the old story, keep things simple.
Yeah, Absolutely. And I think we're actually sadly coming to the end of our discussion, but I think there's a lot of things here, and I think Marta, you raised, and Bryan, that will have been developed over the years, are extremely robust, and we shouldn't let go, and particularly the ethical aspects of making sure that all the issues, as you said, Marta, relating to patients' rights and everything are absolutely governed. But I think that what COVID has done for us is really to be brave, to do things differently. And overall, and I think that in terms of the robustness of the data, the way we've looked at it, it has driven us to question how we do the trials that we do. And I'm hoping that the best bits of what we've had to change will carry forward, and where we have some redundancy potentially in less source data verification, better remote monitoring and so on, and program designs that are more efficient, including some of the platform designs, that will actually continue. So I'd really like to thank everybody for participating in this. It seems to have gone very quickly, but there are so many different aspects of what we have been doing that have challenged what we do going forward, and have allowed us to collaborate and communicate those things as well in panel discussions such as this. So thank you all very much indeed. And I look forward to having lots of further discussion on the topic in the future.